All right, peace and blessings, everybody. It's Thursday, September the 14th, the year 2017. I've been spending all morning working on the motorcycle, changing the rear brake pads. That's very important to have good brakes. Mine were squealing. Even though they weren't worn down, they were still squealing, so maybe there was some contamination on the pads, I'm not sure. Anyway, the new pads stopped the squealing, so I feel pretty good about that. All right, we are going to read a book report from a neo-Nazi. His name is William White. I don't know if it's fair to call him a neo-Nazi, although he said that he doesn't think black people have any souls. That's a pretty terrible thought when you think about it, but we don't put people in prison for being a racist, right? I mean, the head of the new Black Panthers, I think his name is King Shamir Shabazz, he wants to kill all white babies and kill all crackers, and I don't see nobody putting him in prison. So anyway, this William White guy, he has a website called overthrow.com or something, and I've been communicating with him, and he has some pretty crazy thoughts. I don't really have a lot in common with him. He's not a Christian. I think he refers to himself as a pagan. I told him that I'm a Bible-believing follower of the Lord Jesus Christ and believe that King James Bible's perfect, and that Jesus is the way, the truth, the life. No man cometh unto the Father but by Jesus. And I don't think he believes that. But anyway, he wrote a book report, believe it or not, on Bill Fulton's book. And I read the first paragraph, and I thought, well, I better go get my recorder and just read this thing right into YouTube. And so here is a book report written by a neo-Nazi prisoner who believes that black people doesn't have any souls. But take it for what it's worth. You guys know what I think about Bill Fulton's book. I'm waiting until I get just the right words to update my Amazon.com review. But anyway, here's Bill White. He says, for publication, federal investigators I have known. And it's kind of long too, so it's going to go on quite a while here. I have been reading the book Blood of Patriots, a federal informant genre biography. The kind of book where some pathetic scumbag recruited by... you know... Even though I don't got a lot in common with this dude, he starts his book report off right. The kind of book where some pathetic scumbag recruited by the FBI tells the exciting story of how he took down some harmless person with unusual ideas, magnifying the threat he faced several times over in the process. In this case, I know the details of the operation the author was involved in, and I know that, like most informants, he primarily targeted other informants and really was just a paid actor in an FBI fantasy, not a key player in the takedown of a real and dangerous organization. But the book is interesting, as such books always are, as they give insight into not only the personalities and motivations of the scumbags recruited by the FBI, but also the methods by which such scumbags are recruited, directed, and manipulated by their FBI handlers. Given a choice, I prefer the former federal agent genre, something like the very educational No Angel, but all perspectives on these operations have value. In any case, perusing this pathetic sack of crap's writings recalls to mind the pathetic sack of crap with which the FBI and their private assistants of various sorts plagued me with over the years, and would like to still plague me if they didn't realize that I've been onto them for more than a while. What I find most interesting is the approaches that the informants make. It is always the same thing. The FBI has someone who doesn't like the target for personal reasons and encourages the person to call the other person up and pretend to bridge the gap or otherwise mend relations. This is one of the reasons that I don't get angry at white nationalists who don't accept my apologies or resume talking to me when I sincerely try to make up for some of the errors of my misguided younger years. I would be suspicious of me too. After bridging the gap, the informants generally let the other person run their mouths, and as only people with serious psychiatric or personality disorders blather on about the crimes they have committed or are going to commit or want to commit. The people that the FBI ends up targeting aren't generally actually criminals, but merely people who don't have the good sense not to give voice to their fantasies. Many of the tactics and techniques I've read about in these books I can relate to people who have targeted me. For instance, the approach of the informant in this book is almost exactly like the approach I had from Brian Holland one evening in Roanoke, though Holland had never had a negative encounter with me. And the bridge the gap technique is something that the FBI tried to instruct a friend of mine who may have been mad at me over something, I don't know, to use on me perhaps a decade ago. As I have remarked with others, the FBI is really very limited in their range. They have scripts, and they stick to those scripts. So once you know the scripts, you can recognize them, and you can pick out the FBI and their inept scumbag informants about a mile away. And I do. Anyways, my first thought goes back to 2004 when I first began to invest in property in Roanoke, Virginia. No matter what various nutballs have said, my real estate business was not part of some grandiose scheme to ethnically cleanse southwest Roanoke. My business was part of a plan to make money. And when you can buy a duplex for $30,000 and rent it out for $10,000 a year in adjusted gross income, that's a good investment. And in fact, that is what I did all day long, every day. Where I ended up going wrong was accumulating too many abandoned properties as inventory for my construction business, and having a business model that depended on the stability of the housing market at a time when the housing market crashed. Plus, also getting ripped off by a contractor on a big job and marrying the wrong women. These things don't bother me. Life is full of problems, and as you learn as you go. Anyone who thinks back that long, most folk probably won't bother, will recall that there was a big campaign to run me out of business that was ultimately initiated by Erica Hardwick, a U.S. Marshals and likely FBI informant, and conducted and or coordinated by the FBI itself. Now, at the time that I started buying houses, I was at best marginally involved in white nationalism. Had Hardwick not gone after me, I probably would have abandoned political activity. But it was not useful to the government and the FBI for me to abandon my political activities, so they did everything they can to push me deeper into it. First, they had the local newspaper run phony articles claiming that I was involved in racism against my tenants. Then they had their private housing agencies send out housing testers to try to prove that I was discriminating in my housing business. Now, in reality, I was doing no such thing. I bought properties that were occupied by people who were very marginal, more marginal even than the people I later made my business renting to. And being marginal petty criminals, these people were willing to tell any lie that came into their head to make a few dollars. When they were invited to make phony claims of racism, the ones who were not paying their rent had no problem filing phony complaints that they were being evicted because of racism, and not because they were refusing to pay the rent. The Roanoke Housing Agency then got involved by refusing to tender Section 8 checks to me, a move which ultimately ended in the eviction of the one Section 8 tenant I inherited. These scumbags tried to get one over on me, and they got themselves thrown out of their homes. Had they paid the rent, there never would have been a problem. During this period of intense harassment, various unusual and obvious persons would pull up and try to rent houses from me. I remember one woman, a blonde woman with a short, dykey haircut, who came up to me and tried to chit-chat and how she had a black husband who was also a cop. Apparently the feds had not realized that I had abandoned and renounced anarchism some 5 years earlier when I was 21, and decided that I was still a teenager publishing caricatured anti-government literature. As to the black husband, half of the scumbags in that neighborhood were cracked out shadows of human beings with interracial spouses. In fact, race mixing and drug addiction are generally two things that go closely hand in hand. So as long as she paid the rent, I didn't give a damn what she did with her time. But I didn't say anything. She was obviously an informant. Her overture was obvious. And because I truly in my heart did not give a damn what she did with her time, I had nothing to say to her. The latter characteristic, I think, has always been the biggest problem for the FBI in their pathetic efforts to lure me into various plots. I truly do not care what other people think or do with their time. I am used to people coming up to me and making pronouncement that they're bizarre, delusional, nonsensical, or just plain offensive. Let me read that sentence again. I am used to people coming up to me and making pronouncement that are bizarre, delusional, nonsensical, or just plain offensive. And as long as they do not involve me, I do not care. I do not need other people to think like I do. I don't have to make pronouncements as other people to validate my own self. I write. If people want to read it, they do. If not, they don't. I like it when people publish my material, but I do not need people to do so. And that difference is what sets me aside from, say, the typical kook that the FBI entraps in a terror plot. The kook needs to get other people roped into their fantasy to validate themselves. I don't need or want any sort of validation from others. I will also note that this is why the FBI had to frame me to put me into prison. They could never drag me in with their pathetic lies. So they cheated. The dykey blonde woman was then followed by another setup, which I always loved. In my neighborhood, the average income when I started buying property was $14,000 a year. If a person made $18,000 a year, they generally qualified to rent from me. If they made $24,000 or $30,000 a year for the entire household, they were an ideal tenant. If they made under $10,000, I had a few efficiencies that I could accommodate them. And even with such low standards, I had to frequently turn away people who found the income qualifications too high. So into this neighborhood, I get a white family dressed in a dirty, beat-up clothes who pulled up in a dirty, beat-up van. When I gave them an application, they claimed to make $50,000 a year. They left, and 10 minutes later, a Negro couple pulls up in a mid-sized car, very cleanly dressed, wanting to look at the same apartment. They also claimed to make $50,000 a year. It was the most obvious tester setup I had ever seen. To be frank, all the blathering in the Roanoke Times about the West End being historically African American, it was not. It was 50% white and 50% black, cracked in, with the most of the black living on the other side of Patterson Avenue near the Hurt Park housing project, and or coming into the neighborhood across the railroad bridge from northwest, where there was another housing project. My side of Patterson Avenue was filled primarily with crack addicts and the occasional crack house set up by Roanoke's Negro gangs. Thus, while many poor whites rented in the West End because they couldn't afford to go anywhere else, and some more middle-class whites would rent there for a month or two because they didn't know the neighborhood or Negro family earning $50,000 a year, no Negro family earning $50,000 a year was going to rent in the West End. Anyways, reading the transparent scripted efforts of the informant in the book, I'm reading to get information out of others reminded me of these transparent scripted efforts to show that I was discriminating in my housing all of those years ago. And having been reminded, I thought I would share some old FBI stories. Not because I need to blow my horn or convert anyone to my point of view, but because I enjoy writing and sharing the humor of the scum who control this illegitimate internationalist entity, and hope that those who read this will share in the common fun. Well, you know, I've known some older folks in life that no matter what the conversation started out as, you can start out on any topic, but ultimately the conversation ends up about them. And that kind of reminds me of William White. He started off doing a book report on Schaefer Cox and the book Bill Fulton wrote, but then he ends up talking about his life and his own FBI informants, which is pretty typical. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. It's pretty typical. But anyway, that's what William White has to say, and it is what it is. The last line of peaceful defense between a tyrannical government and the defendant is jury nullification.